Alright guys, here we are with some Fablehaven. We are in chapter 14 called Reunion. Okay, I wonder who's going to be reunited. Who do you think? Do you have any guesses? Think about it. Let's read, okay? Seth stripped off another piece of the spongy wall and placed it in his mouth. Do you guys remember where he is? He's inside that little capsule, like kind of nut thing that Coulter gave to him. Coulter shoved it in his mouth. Remember, he got sucked inside of it, and then what happened after that? He got eaten by Olaf. So he's inside this thing, inside Olaf, and he's eating the inside of it. Remember, they said it was edible? The texture reminded him of citrus pulp. He chewed it until he was left with a small amount of rough, tasteless matter which he swallowed. Puckering his lips, Seth pressed his mouth against the wall of the cocoon. The harder he kissed the wall, the more moisture flowed into his mouth. Water with a hint of honeydew. Olaf roared again, and the cocoon shuddered. Seth flopped around the cocoon, lurching from side to side. By the time he braced himself, the movement stopped. Seth was growing accustomed to the roars and the flurries of motion, although the thought that he was listening to the roar from inside a cocoon, inside the belly of a demon, remained peculiar. Seth had tried to sleep. When he had first started dozing, the roars had awakened him every time. Eventually, with the help of his mounting fatigue, he had managed a few fitful stretches of slumber. Time was becoming meaningless in the endless blackness. Only the growls and the motion of the demon interrupted the monotony. That and snacking on fragments of the padded walls. How long had he been inside Olaf? A day? 2 days? 3? At least Seth remained reasonably comfortable inside his womb-like enclosure. It fit him rather snugly. There was just enough room to move his arms when he wanted to pick at the walls. Even when he was flung around, he never got injured, because the walls were soft and there was not enough room for him to get shaken into a dangerous position. With so little space, it seemed that the air would run out in a matter of minutes, but his breathing remained unstrained, so he's able to breathe just fine. Being swallowed by Olaf had made no difference. The air remained fresh. The closeness of the cocoon made him a little claustrophobic, but in the darkness, when he lay still, he could pretend that the enclosure was spacious. Olaf gave a particularly ferocious roar. The cocoon quaked. The demon emitted a couple of prolonged growls, followed by the loudest roar Seth had heard yet. Seth wondered if the demon was in a fight. The snarls and roars continued. It felt oddly like the cocoon was being squeezed, first by its head, then near its shoulders, then at the waist, and then at his knees and feet. The vicious growls continued unabated. The cocoon was jostled one final time, and silence followed. Seth lay in stillness, waiting for the turbulence to resume. He waited several minutes, expecting more roaring at any moment. The growls had been almost desperate. Now all was eerily calm. Could Olaf have been killed? Or perhaps the demon had won a battle and then collapsed in exhaustion. It was easily the longest interval of motionless silence Seth had experienced since being swallowed. Uneventful minutes accumulated until Seth felt his eyelids dropping. He slipped into a deep slumber. Mendingo dumped Kendra onto the ground. So do you remember how the naiads had thrown Mendingo back out of the lake, and then he captured Kendra and ran away with her? A thick carpet of wildflowers cushioned her landing. The air smelled of blossoms and fruit. As disoriented as the dash through the woods had left her, Kendra knew where they were, at the site where the forgotten chapel once stood. The last order from Muriel to Mendingo must have been to bring Kendra to the chapel. During the entire run through the woods, Kendra had wriggled and twisted and squirmed. She had kicked Mendingo in the head and tried to unhinge his limbs, but the oversized puppet had just shifted his grip and continued dodging onward. She had been carried upside down, over his shoulder, and curled up in a ball. No matter how vigorously she struggled, Mendingo had adjusted. Kendra lay sprawled on a bed of wildflowers beneath a starless sky, the dim night pungent and mild. Mendingo crouched and started digging, clawing at the soil with wooden fingers, tossing stones aside when he encountered them. Somewhere under this hill, Muriel was buried, imprisoned with Bahamut. Apparently the order had not merely been to bring Kendra to the chapel, but to bring Kendra to Muriel. Kendra sprang to her feet and bolted down the hillside. She had not traveled 6 steps before Mandingo slammed into her from behind, tackling her near the trunk of a peach tree. They rolled and she wrenched her back. Kendra shrieked as Mandingo clung to her with unnatural strength, wrapping her with his arms and legs. At least if he was clinging to her, he wasn't digging. What would happen if he tunneled down to Muriel? Would the witch issue new commands to her wooden servant? Would she get in touch with Vanessa and figure out a way to escape? "You're in a fine predicament," a tiny voice giggled. It was high and musical, like the tinkling of a little bell. Kendra turned her head. A yellow fairy hovered near her face, emitting a golden glow. She wore a shimmering slip of gossamer and had wings like a bumblebee and a pair of antennae. "Well, I wouldn't mind some help," Kendra said. "Oh, a heroine of your reputation should have no trouble escaping such a feeble adversary," the fairy said airily. "Well, you'd be surprised how strong he is," Kendra said. "His magic is weak," the fairy sniffed. "Muriel is sealed in a mighty prison. Her will no longer supports the enchantment she left behind, and yet you can do nothing but beg for help. Forgive me if I am unimpressed." Mandingo was dragging Kendra up the hill towards the spot where he had started digging. "Well, obviously I'm having some trouble," Kendra said. "I don't know what to do." The fairy laughed a twittering sound. "Oh, this is priceless. The great Kendra Sorensen being hauled to the dirt by a puppet." "You act like I'm some kind of big shot," Kendra said. "I think you're projecting. I know I'm just a girl. Without the help of all the fairies I would have died last summer." "Oh, false humility is more insulting than open pride," the fairy sniffed. Mandingo picked up Kendra, cradling her in his arms, folding her knees up to her chin and keeping her arms trapped at her sides. He resumed digging with his feet. "Do I look like I could possibly feel superior to anyone?" Kendra demanded. The fairy drifted close, hovering in front of Kendra's nose. "The magic inside you is dazzling. By comparison, he is like a faint star next to the noonday sun." "I don't know how to use it," Kendra said. "Don't ask me," the fairy said. "You are the gifted luminary our queen chose to honor. I can't show you how to unlock your magic any more than you can teach me how to use mine." "Could you use your magic on him?" Kendra asked. "Change him back into a little puppet?" "Oh, the spell that animates him remains potent," the fairy said, "but the command guiding his actions is weak. With some help I could probably turn him." "Oh, please, would you?" Kendra said. "Well, I am here to guard the prison," the fairy said. "All of us who are imps take turns as sentries." "You were an imp?" Kendra asked. "Oh, don't remind me. It was a graceless existence." "He's trying to dig down to Muriel," Kendra said. "If you're a guard, shouldn't you stop him?" "I suppose I should," the fairy conceded. "But the plums smell so wonderful right now, and the night is so fine. Rounding up fairies is such a drudgery." "I'd be so grateful," Kendra said. We fairies crave nothing more than your gratitude, Kendra. We so look up to you. One kind word and our little hearts are racing. All we wish for is the love of a big, clumsy girl." "You're terrible," Kendra said. "I am, aren't I?" the fairy said, finally sounding flattered. "Tell you what, it is my responsibility to guard Muriel and Bahumat. You're right about that. So maybe I could check if anybody is bored enough to lend you a hand." The little fairy zipped away. Kendra hoped she was really going for help. The fairy didn't sound very reliable. Kendra tried to force the lumberjack's arms apart by straightening her legs. The effort strained her back. Mandingo was too strong. As Mandingo dug deeper, Kendra's hope that the fairy would return began to dwindle. Mandingo was nearly waist deep in a hole before a small group of fairies swarmed around them, glimmering in prismatic colors. "See, I told you," the little yellow fairy tinkled. "He's certainly tunneling towards Muriel," another fairy said. "Not very efficiently," a third chimed in. "Would you like us to turn him to obey your will?" a fourth fairy asked. Kendra recognized the speaker as the silver fairy who had led the charge when the fairies attacked Bahumat. "Sure, that would be great," Kendra said. The fairies hovered in a ring around Mandingo and Kendra. When they began chanting, colors flared and sparked, making Kendra blink. Kendra could no longer comprehend what they were saying. It was like trying to listen in on multiple conversations at once. All she caught were tangled fragments of meaning that together made no sense. After a final blazing flash, the fairies fell silent. Most of them soared away. Mendingo continued digging. "He is now yours to command," the Silver Fairy reported. "Mendingo, stop digging," Kendra said. Mendingo stopped. "Mendingo, set me down." He set her down. "Thank you," Kendra said to the Yellow Fairy and the Silver Fairy, the only ones who remained. "A pleasure to help," the Silver Fairy said. Though pitched high, her voice was richer than the others. The Yellow Fairy shook her head and buzzed away. "Why are they hurrying away?" Kendra asked. "They have done their duty," the Silver Fairy said. "None of the fairies have been very friendly," Kendra said. "Friendliness is not always our strength," the Silver Fairy said, "especially to one who has shown such kindness by our queen. You are much envied. That means they're jealous of her." "I was only trying to protect Fablehaven and save my family," Kendra said. "And you succeeded, which only elevates your status," the Silver Fairy said. "Why are you speaking to me?" Kendra asked. "I suppose I am peculiar," the Silver Fairy said. "I am of a more serious mind than many of the others. I am called Ciara." "Well, I'm Kendra." "Fortunately for you, we all have an interest in keeping Bahamut imprisoned," Ciara said. "Otherwise I question whether I would have been able to rally sufficient help to help turn Mendingo. Although Bahamut rightly blames you above all others, his vengeance against the fairies would be merciless were he to escape." "Couldn't you just imprison him again?" Kendra asked. "Oh, your elixir made us so much bigger and our powers so much stronger. Without it, we would be no match against a demon like Bahamut." "Couldn't I get the elixir again?" Kendra asked. "Oh, my dear girl, you are so naive, which may be partly why our queen condescended to share her tears with you. Your decision to tread near her shrine would have normally been rewarded with a swift departure from this life. I suspect that she spared you because of your innocence, though her reasons are her own." "Fablehaven is in danger again," Kendra said. "I could use some help." "Do not seek favors from her again unless she invites you," Ciara said. "Now that you know better, irreverence will not be tolerated." Kendra recalled how she had sensed that going to the island would be a mistake. "Could you help me?" "Well, obviously I could because I have," Ciara said, twinkling. "Have you seen Olok the Glutton? He is a demon who is after my brother." "The Glutton is becoming dormant. He will not bother you." Kendra felt a stab of grief at the news. If the demon was slowing down, it meant that Seth was truly gone. "There is more to the problem than Mendingo and the demon," Kendra said. "Bad people have taken over the house. They captured my grandparents and Dale and Tanu. They want to steal something precious from Fablehaven. If they have their way, they'll release all the demons from their prisons." "It is challenging for us to mind the affairs of mortals," Ciara said. "Dwelling on such concerns is not in our nature. You made the binding of Bahamut our duty with authority from our queen, and we continue to attend to that duty. I keep a sentinel stationed here always." Kendra scanned the surrounding area. Her gaze settled on the hill where Warren's cottage sat, some ways off. "Could you help me heal Warren, Dale's brother?" "The curse upon him is much too strong," Ciara said. "All the fairies in Fablehaven together could not break it." "What if you had the elixir?" "That might be another matter. I wonder, why did you fail to return the bowl to the shrine?" Kendra scrunched her eyebrows. "Well, Grandpa thought it would be more appropriate to toss it back into the water. He thought it would be disrespectful to go back." "The Naiads have claimed it as a tribute," Ciara said. "In the future, bear in mind, if you take something in need, you will not be punished for returning it in gratitude. Such actions would have harmed your standing with Her Majesty. Or such actions would not have harmed your standing with Her Majesty." "I'm sorry, Ciara," Kendra said. "We thought they would return it." "Oh, the Naiads fear and respect our queen, but elected to accept the bowl as a gift freely given," Ciara said. "I sought to retrieve it, but they would not yield, blaming you for awarding it to them. Some among the fairies hold you culpable. They say you're to blame." The Silver Fairy hovered higher. "It appears the situation here is now under control." "Wait, please don't leave," Kendra said. "I don't know what to do." "I will try to make the others mindful of the threat you named," Ciara said, "but do not count on aid from our kind. I admire your goodness, Kendra, and I wish you no harm." Shiara streaked away, vanishing into the night. Kendra turned and studied Wendigo. He stood motionless, awaiting instructions. Kendra sighed. Ugh, the only person on her side was a big, creepy puppet. Groaning, Seth stirred. He tried to stretch, but the effort was thwarted by snug confines of cocoon. The realization of where he was caused him to snap awake. How long had he been asleep? Opening his eyes, he was surprised to find the inside of the cocoon illuminated by a soft green glow, as if light were filtering in from the outside. The cocoon remained unusually still. Was Olak sleeping? Why was there suddenly light? Was the light passing through both Olak and the cocoon? Seth waited. Nothing changed. Eventually started yelling and tried to rock the cocoon by flinging himself from one side to the other. There came no roars, no growls, no movement except a slight tilting as he shifted his position. Just silence, and even then muted glow. Was the cocoon no longer inside Olak? Had he been cuffed up like a hairball? Perhaps the cocoon was indigestible. He dared not hope for such good fortune, but it would explain the lack of growls and the new illumination. Had Grandpa come to his rescue? If so, why wasn't anyone encouraging him to open the cocoon? Could it be some sort of a trick? If he opened the cocoon, would Olak gobble him up again, this time without a cocoon to impede digestion? Could he still be in the evil grove with the revenants? He didn't think so. He felt no hint of the chilling, involuntary fear. Seth decided to wait. Acting rashly had gotten him into trouble before. He folded his arms and listened, straining his senses for any indication of what was going on outside the cocoon. Seth quickly became fidgety. He had never coped well with boredom. When the cocoon had swayed and jostled with the movements of the demons, and when the silence had been interrupted by ferocious growls, Seth had remained on edge, which kept him occupied. The motionless silence was relentless. How much time had passed? Time always moved slower when he was bored. He could remember certain classes at school where it felt like the clock was broken. Every minute felt like a lifetime, but this was worse. No classmates to joke with, no paper to doodle on, not even the drone of a teacher to give shape to the monotony. Seth began picking at the wall of the cocoon. He didn't have to break all the way out. He just wanted to see how tough it would be. He ate part of the wall as he went. Soon he'd made a pretty good hole in the wall in front of his face. As he dug deeper, the texture of the wall was changing, becoming goopy like peanut butter. It was the best tasting part of the wall so far, reminding him vaguely of eggnog. After scooping away the eggnog paste, he reached a membrane. It was slick, and it was rippled when he prodded it. Seth ruptured the membrane by jabbing it with his fingers, and clear liquid gushed out, soaking him. Now light was really pouring into the cocoon through the hole. He had reached a hard, translucent shell. Silvery light shone through it, overpowering the green glow. He was obviously no longer inside Olak, and as he dug, Seth had neither heard nor felt any indication that Olak was near. Who knew if he could get another chance like this? He had to try to escape. The demon might return any time. Seth began punching at the shell. The blows hurt his knuckles, but the shell began to crack. Soon his hand burst through and unfiltered sunlight flooded in. Seth worked furiously to widen the hole. The effort took longer than he liked. Now that his protective cocoon was breached, he wanted to get out as quickly as possible, before some creature could come along and corner him. Finally, the hole was big enough for Seth to squirm through. With his head, shoulders, and arms out of the cocoon, Seth froze. Olak sat not 20 feet away, back to him. The demon had grown considerably. Olak was bigger than the elephant Seth had seen at the zoo, not just taller, but much broader as well. No wonder the demon had been able to swallow him. The glutton was immense. Seth realized that he had made the worst mistake of his life, and that he would now soon die. But why hadn't he waited to open the cocoon? Why had he been so impatient? But Olak didn't turn around. The huge demon continued to sit, motionless, with his back to him. Seth began to notice a terrible stench. He looked around at the shell of the cocoon. It was smooth, with a luster of mother of pearl, except that it was streaked with smelly brown matter. Huge clumps of mushy brown excrement sat on the ground nearby, buzzing with flies. Suddenly, Seth understood. He had passed right through the demon, safe inside the cocoon. It was the only explanation. In one end, out the other. So he'd gotten pooped out of him. Ew. And he was like in the middle of all that poop right there. Gross. Olaf remained still. The demon didn't even seem to breathe. He was like a statue. And judging from what Seth could see, the clearing he was in was not the haunted grove. Seth squirmed the rest of the way out of the cocoon, trying his best to avoid touching the excrement. Once free of the cocoon, he picked his way through the minefield of reeking demon piles, slinking away from the enormous glutton. While he was stepping around one stinky pile, a dry branch cracked loudly underfoot. Seth's entire body tensed. After a breathless moment, he hazarded a glance at the demon. The glutton hadn't budged, and he continued to hold perfectly still. Deciding that he had to confirm that the demon was no longer a threat, Seth started looping around so he could view Olaf from the front, giving the demon a wide berth. Coming round to the front, Death found the demon seated in the same position as when he had first laid eyes on him in the funeral home. The texture of his skin had changed. The demon was a statue once more. Seth could not help smiling. He was no longer doomed, and until some new victim made the same mistake of feeding him, Olaf the glutton was frozen. Seth surveyed his surroundings. He was in a small clearing encircled by trees. He realized he could be anywhere on the preserve, and he needed to get his bearings. Seth wished for his emergency kit. He had dropped it back in the grove. His only remaining asset was the glove that Coulter had thrust into his hand. Seth had stowed the glove in his pocket. He tugged it out and pulled it on. The instant he put on the glove, Seth could no longer see himself. It was a strange sensation. Like all that was left of him was a pair of transparent eyeballs. He held up his hands in front of his face. When he moved them, his body flickered back into view. But when he held still, he didn't just see right through them. He saw no sign of himself. It was as if he'd been completely disembodied. The glove was a little loose on his hand, but it did not fit him badly. Fortunately, it had belonged to Coulter and not Tanu. Keeping it on should afford him some protection as he tried to figure out where he was. The sun was high in the sky, and for the moment it could be of no help determining direction. And since he had no idea where on the preserve he was, identifying north would not help him much anyhow. He needed a landmark. Seth stepped into the center of the clearing, weaving around the piles of dung. The biggest stack was as high as his waist. Seth stood with his hands on his hips. The trees circling the clearing were too tall. He could see nothing beyond them. He glanced at the demon. Climbing Olaf would give him an extra 15 feet or so, but he did not want to get anywhere near that mouth. There were no apparent trails leading out of the clearing, but the undergrowth was not heavy, so he chose a direction and set off. After a while, he became used to how his body would vanish whenever he paused, then reappear as he continued walking. His first priority was to find a landmark or a vantage point that would allow him to get his bearings. For all he knew, each step was carrying him farther away from the main house. He came across a pair of deer. They paused and looked towards him. He held still, vanishing from sight. After a moment, they bounded away. Had they caught his scent? Farther along, he glimpsed a great black owl roosting in a tree. The feathered head swiveled towards him, round eyes staring. Seth had never known owls could be so large or so black. Even as he stood motionless and invisible, the golden eyes seemed to stare into his. In that instant, Seth realized that he had not consumed any milk. It was a new day, and he had slept. He could not see the true forms of any of the magical creatures. The owl could be anything. The deer could have been anything. He thought back to Olaf. Had the demon really looked as much like a statue as it had seemed to him, or was that another illusion? Seth backed away from the owl, eyeing the large bird as he distanced himself and circled around it. The dark owl did not turn, but the head pivoted, golden eyes trained on Seth until he passed out of sight. Before long, Seth came to an unusual path. Once it had been a wide road paved with flagstones, though now it was choked with weeds and slender young trees. Many of the paving stones were out of place or hidden beneath the vegetation, but plenty were visible to help him follow the road. Seth had never seen a paved path at Fablehaven, and even though the road was in disrepair, he decided that following an old road was probably safer than roaming aimlessly through the forest. The path was not level, and many of the lichen-covered flagstones were crooked and loose. forcing Seth to watch his step or risk turning an ankle. At one point he stopped as a long snake slithered through the weeds. He held his breath, unsure whether it was really a snake or something more dangerous in disguise. The serpent did not appear to notice him. Seth passed the decaying remnants of a humble cabin not far off the path to one side. 2 walls and a stone chimney remained partially intact. Farther along, he spotted the jumbled remnants of a smaller shelter, splintered and rotten beyond recognition. It might have once been a shack or a lean-to. He passed a few more ruins of crude shelters before the road led him to an open area where he stood facing an impressive manor like a big house, surprisingly undamaged compared to the road and the other dwellings he had passed. The manor was 3 stories tall, with 4 large pillars in the front. White walls were now gray, and the windows were covered by heavy green shutters. Flowering vines twisted around the pillars and climbed the walls. The road formed a circular driveway in front of the manor, doubling back on itself. Seth remembered hearing about an abandoned mansion somewhere on the property. It had once been the main house at Fablehaven and the center of a community, of which the dilapidated shelters were probably remnants. He could not recall ever hearing why the mansion had been abandoned. Given his current situation, one detail about the manor stood out above the rest. It occupied high ground. He suspected that from the roof he would be able to get his bearings. Did he dare risk entering the house? Normally, he would intrude in a heartbeat. He loved exploring, but he knew that barging into an abandoned mansion on Fablehaven property was a risky proposition. Here, ghosts and monsters were not only real, they were everywhere, and the manor had to be vacant for a reason. It was larger and more grand than the house his grandparents occupied. He had to find out where he was. Although the sun was still fairly high, nightfall would inevitably come, and he didn't want to get caught in the woods after dark. Plus, everybody had to be terribly worried. If he entered the house, it would help him figure out where he was on the property, and it might be worth the risk. Although, it could be cool to see what the manor looked like inside as well. Who knew? There might even be some treasure in there. Of course, he's looking for treasure, right? Seth walked cautiously towards the house. He decided to take it slow, keeping himself tensed to bolt at the first sign of trouble. The day was hot and still. Clouds of gnats twirled above the lawn. Oh, we have so many gnats right now. He could imagine carriages pulling up to the house, being greeted by uniformed servants. Those days were long gone, though. He mounted the steps to the front porch, passing the pillars. He had always liked houses with pillars. They seemed so stately, like true mansions. The front door was open. Seth went to the nearest shuttered window. The green paint of the shutters blistered and peeled, and when he tugged on the shutters, they rattled, but they would not swing open. Seth returned to the front door and eased it open. With the window shuttered and no other lights on, the house was gloomy. Beyond the cavernous entry hall, he could see into a spacious living room. The furniture looked expensive, even under a heavy layer of dust. Everything was quiet. Stepping inside, Seth left the door wide open. His passage stirred up dust on the floor. Standing inside the house was barely cooler than standing outside in the sun. It smelled musty with a hint of mildew. Great sheets of cobwebs hung from the high ceiling and veiled the chandelier. He decided it might be wise to hurry. A grand staircase led up from the entry hall to the second floor. Seth charged up the stairs, kicking up dust with each step, leaving footprints on the dingy carpeting. At the top of the stairs hung a sepia portrait of a man and a woman. The man looked serious and wore a mustache. The woman was Lena, much younger than when Seth had known her, but even under the film of dust on the glass, her identity was unmistakable. She had a slight, knowing smile. Seth hurried down the hall until he found another staircase, which granted access to a 3rd level. Climbing a higher, narrower hall, he tried a random door and found it locked. The next door he tried was locked as well, but the third opened into a bedroom. Already he had a good view, but only in one direction, so Seth stepped out onto the roof. The roof was steep enough that if he fell, he could conceivably roll off the edge and fall 3 stories to the driveway. Treading gingerly, wood creaking, Seth moved to the crest of the roof like the highest point. Standing atop the manor, he found himself just high enough to get a decent view of the surrounding area. Unfortunately, not much looked familiar. He identified the 4 hills that surrounded the valley where Coulter had led him, but he was not sure from what direction he was looking at the 4 hills. Slowly he turned, scanning the horizon, searching for clues. In one direction he could see what he suspected was the beginning of a marshland. In another direction he saw a single hill. On the hill he saw a rooftop peeking above the trees. Warren's cottage! It had to be! He could barely see the top of it from his current vantage point. He stood on his tiptoes, trying to improve his angle. It was a good distance away, but if he could reach that cottage, he knew how to find his way back to the main house from there. Sweeping the area with a final look, Seth soaked up all the details he could. Back on the ground, the way would not be so plain, but the sun was moving, casting enough shadow now for him to feel confident which way was west, and by knowing west, he should be able to maintain his heading as he hiked to the cottage. He turned to the window and climbed back into the room, closing and latching the shutters. Seth surveyed the room. It was well appointed, but he didn't see anything worth carrying all the way back to the cottage. Of course, now that he had been here, he could probably find his way back. Maybe there was some money or some jewelry lying around someplace, maybe in the master bedroom. Might be worth taking a look around for a few minutes before he departed. After all, it wouldn't be stealing since the house was abandoned. He guessed a good place to start looking would be the second floor where the rooms had seemed bigger. After quickly checking a few dresser drawers and glancing inside a nightstand, Seth exited the room. He stopped, staring down at the far end of the hall where the dust on the floor was swirling in a low circle. The sight was unsettling, eddying dust at the height of his shins. Where was this breeze coming from? The staircase that accessed the second floor was about halfway down the hall towards the swirling dust. Seth found that his mouth was suddenly dry. He did not want to move towards the dust, but the hall came to a dead end in the other direction. Seth moved lightly towards the unnatural disturbance. Suddenly the dust began whirling more fiercely, rising in a column from floor to ceiling. Seth ran toward the dust devil as it moved down the hall towards him. Something told him that if he lost that race to the staircase, he would deeply regret it. His pounding footfalls kicked up dust, but it was hardly noticeable as the wind from the oncoming vortex filled the hall with blinding particles. Seth squinted and tucked his head. When he reached the staircase, the whirlwind was scarcely 10 feet away. Wind lashed at his clothes. Seth darted down the stairway, the whoosh of the vortex close behind him. At the bottom of the stairs, he turned quickly down the hall towards the grand staircase. It sounded like a hurricane was on his tail. A wave of dust engulfed him from behind as he reached the top of the grand staircase. Not daring to look back, Seth plunged down the stairs 2 at a time. Something smashed against the wall just behind him. Howling wind filled his ears. Coughing, Seth felt like he was lost in a sandstorm as decades of dust saturated the air. At the bottom of the stairs, as he dashed for the front door, Seth glanced back. The vortex had grown. It was floating down towards him, across the high entry hall, skipping the stairs and growing taller by the instant. Tentacles of dust stretched out from the center of the whirlwind. An icy gale hurled stinging dust into his eyes. Seth lunged out the open door and slammed it behind him. Choking on dust, he raced down the steps of the driveway and sprinted across the yard in the direction of the cottage. Only when the manor was out of sight did he finally relax his pace. Oh, who knew it was going to be a haunted manor? Well, most people would probably know, but Seth, of course, is making reckless decisions. All right, Kendra sat at the table with Warren, racking her brain to decide her next move. Mendingo stood guard outside the window. Despite the company of the mute albino and the oversized puppet, she had rarely felt so alone. Mendingo had proved to be quite useful. After he had gathered fruit for her on the small hill that covered the forgotten chapel, the puppet had carried her piggyback to Warren's cottage as dawn began to streak the sky. By now the day was starting to fade, and she still had no plan except to keep watch out the window in case Vanessa decided to pay her a visit. Kendra had spread out all the potions from Tanu's pouch on the table. She knew which container held the bottled-up emotions, but was unsure which emotion was which. The rest of the potions could be just about anything. She thought about sampling one, but then she became worried that might be poisonous or otherwise harmful concoction meant for enemies. Can't say enemy. That's funny. Kendra concluded that she should save testing random potions as a last resort. She needed to find a way to free her grandparents. There were tools in the cottage, plenty of items she could use as weapons, but if Vanessa was still controlling Tanu, Kendra had a hard time picturing herself succeeding. Mendingo could help, but Kendra would be surprised if the puppet was able to enter the yard since he could not enter the cabin. She was pretty sure Grandpa had to grant special permission to any non-mortal visitors. The fairies were permitted in the garden only by his consent. Mendingo started tapping at the window. She had told him to warn her if anyone approached. What could she do? Mendingo, protect Warren and me from harm, but stay out of sight until my command. Mendingo crouched behind a bush near the porch as Kendra made her way to the window. She peeked out, moving her head slowly, and she could not believe what she saw. Seth was emerging from the trees, walking up the path to the cottage. Initially she was shocked. When she recovered, Kendra ran to the door and flung it open, tears of happiness and relief springing into her eyes. "Seth!" she cried. "Kendra?" he said, stopping in his tracks. "You're not dead!" "Sure I am. I'm a ghost. I've been sent here with a warning." Seth could not help but smiling. "I thought I'd never see you say anything idiotic again. Who else is with you?" "Just Mendingo and Warren. Hurry, come inside." "Ha ha!" Seth said, continuing the cottage at a leisurely pace. "I'm serious," Kendra said. "Come inside. Bad things have happened." "And I'm serious too," he said. "Muriel called me back from the grave to deliver a singing telegram." Kendra put her hands on her hips. "Mendingo, show yourself." The lumberjack jumped out from behind a bush. "Holy cow!" Seth exclaimed, recoiling. "What's he doing here? And why is he taking orders from you?" "Get inside and I will tell you," Kendra said. "I've never been gladder to see anybody. We have a big problem on our hands." Chapter 15 is next. Chapter 15.